One of the main mistakes that people do when making sourdough, especially when they've just started, is choosing the wrong flour. Now I've got two different flours here that I use for my sourdough, and I'm going to explain to you why flour is so incredibly important when making sourdough. When I first started making sourdough, the advice that I was given was use any flour, it doesn't matter. Well, it absolutely does, and let me explain to you why it makes such a difference when you're trying to get good results from sourdough. When wheat is grown by a farmer, there are different types of wheat varieties, and then there are different grades given to wheat after it's grown. So of course, depending on where it's grown, how it's been cared for, what's happened after it's been harvested, makes a huge difference to what happens to the flour that is produced at the end. Now, the one main factor that we're looking at in flour to get a good rise on sourdough is the protein content. Now, there are many other factors within flour that do affect it, depending on the added ingredients that they put in there when they're making the flour, what types of flours that they're using. But from a beginner's perspective, the one thing that's going to really help us in learning how to make good sourdough is using a flour with a high protein content. Now, I've got two different flours here, and I use both of these when making my sourdough. I use this one over here, which is the strong white bread flour, for feeding my starter and keeping that lovely and active. And then I use this one over here, which is the very strong white bread flour, which I use for actually baking the bread. Now, both of them can be used interchangeably. I can feed my starter with this and also bake with it, and I can also feed my starter and bake with this one too. But they do give slightly different results, which is why one is better than the other for the job that I'm giving them to do. So the reason why I feed my starter with this one is that this one here sits at a protein content of about 13 grams per 100. Now, if you're new to this, that value can be found here within the nutritional information content, and you can read it there, and all flours sold in the UK do have that number there. You can take a little look and see what the value it's given, and then you know that you've chosen the right one. So of course, why can't I use one or the other? Why am I using two different flours? This is just purely from my experience, but what I find is that when I use this one here, it gives me a beautifully active starter. I can then use it for making my bread, and then I wait for the 24 hours or thereabouts to finish, and then I can feed it again, and then we move on, and it carries on being incredibly active, and it never truly gets to that sort of vinegary, hungry state where I know that it's actually changing the starter and it's making it a little bit weaker. I do find that when I use the Canadian flour to feed my starter, and I have done them side by side, this one here, it makes it rise incredibly quickly, and then it falls incredibly quickly as well, which means that by the time, if I feed two side by side, by the time this one is ready for its next feed, the one that I fed with the Canadian already has hooch forming on the top and smelling very vinegary. Now, there might be some pluses for that. If I want my starter to rise particularly quickly because I want to bake quicker, then I might want to feed it with this one. But as a general rule, on a daily basis, I feed with the strong white bread flour because it gives me really good results without my starter becoming actively hungry and then becoming quite acidic, which then isn't particularly brilliant for a healthy, long-living starter. So of course, when it comes to the bread making, we want to make sure that the bread rises as much as it possibly can in the oven to give us that fabulous oven spring, so it's all lovely and fluffy and just absolutely beautiful for making sandwiches or just eating. And when you use one with a really high protein content of around 15 grams, you see that absolutely fantastic oven spring. I can make beautiful bread using this one. It's not a problem at all. But this one over here takes a lot of the work out for me. So it means that the flour is doing all of the hard work rather than me. And that is why I do recommend using the Canadian one. So of course, these are the reasons why I do get good results from my starter and from my bread, because the flours themselves are actually doing a lot of the hard work for me. Yes, I can even use plain flour to make a starter and bake bread with and still get a beautiful rise. But I'm the one that's going to have to put in all of the hard work and all of my experience to know how to get the flour to behave in that way. So if you are struggling with making your bread, go and try out a protein content of 13 grams to feed your starter, and also find one with 15 grams of protein to actually bake your bread with. And if you have switched to either of these, do let me know whether or not you've seen good results from that. I'd love to hear from you.